Okay, we'll begin. This afternoon, as you all know, we have two writers, Crystal Wilkinson and Wendell Berry. I'm going to read some, I'm sure you probably are familiar with them and their works, but since we're taping this, I'm going to be reading introductions that may be more formal than we would normally do. Crystal Wilkinson is an author and a poet. I believe sometimes, and you may want to talk about this, sometimes called an Appalachian poet, and who grew up in Kentucky in Casey County. Her work has been published in numerous anthologies and literary magazines. Her books include Blackberries, and Water Street, which are collections of short stories, and then the much-awaited novel, The Birds of Opulence, for which she won the 2016 Ernest Gaines Award for Literary Excellence. Yep. And our conversation will get to Ernie Gaines, I think, as it goes on a little more, too, and his influence in both of your lives and writings. She's also a bookstore owner, so we have that in common with our Berry Center bookstore, along with her partner, Ron Davis, Wild Fig Books and Coffee, located in Lexington, Kentucky, and we may chat about that, too, and those experiences as the afternoon goes on. Wendell Berry is a writer of poetry, essays, short stories, and novels. As you know, a native of Kentucky from a family who has farmed here for at least 5 generations. Wendell and his wife, Tanya Berry, have continued this legacy and lived and farmed here for decades and raised their family. His books are very numerous and too numerous to name, but I'll mention one in particular that has special relevance to the Berry Center and to this conversation, is The Unsettling of America, Culture and Agriculture, first published in 1977. It, as you know, awakened a national and global conversation on the dire state of American agriculture and the demise of rural communities. The Berry Center launched in 2011 to continue this conversation and put, as we say, Wendell Berry's writings into action. He also has numerous recognitions and awards, again, of which I won't go through the list except to say that he is a recipient of the National Humanities Medal and the Jefferson Lecture for 2012. And important to this conversation as well is that Wendell was a Stegner-Wallace Fellow at Stanford University along with Ernest Gaines. And again, I suspect that the friendship and influence of his writings will become part of this discussion. So please welcome Crystal and Wendell. So, we'll see where the conversation goes, of course, but it strikes me that there are just so many common themes between your lives and your writings, which center obviously around growing up in rural regions, and the themes of home place, the lives of country people, the cost of mobility, of moving from one's home place, collective and communal memory, and much more. And certainly, you both write with great affection for the people and the land, and with really great honesty. You know that people can be flawed and they can have beliefs differently than you, but you still write with great affection for them. And I think that's obviously something we'll talk about those themes as the afternoon goes on. But I thought it might be interesting to begin at the beginning a bit and ask about your younger years in Kentucky and influences that shaped you to want to become a writer and the kind of writer you are. As Willa Cather said, basically writers, all their material comes before the age of 15. You may or may not agree with that. But Crystal, you've said it's essential for a writer, or really all of us, but especially writers, to hold on to your imagination and curiosity. And I'm wondering about how that influenced and how you did that growing up. And also in the intro to Blackberries, you talk about eavesdropping a lot, especially on the women folk, and how that influenced your writing and observing women in your family, Certainly that's in your short stories and, of course, the Birds of Opulence as well. So could you talk about that a bit and let us?
Well, I was grandparent raised. I became my grandparents became the keeper of me at 6 weeks old. I was originally born in Hamilton, Ohio. And I think, although it's not serving me well right at this moment, and it often doesn't when I'm on a stage in front of people, but I think that the shyness that I had when I was a child served me well as a writer. And I was so quiet and such an introvert and such an observer that I was often in many, many rooms that I shouldn't have been in. Sort of dictating everything that was going on. And so I think that has stayed with me. Like one of the things that I always admired, long before I even thought about an Ernest Gaines Prize, I was a big fan of his work and also been a fan of Wendell's for many years. And one of the things that struck me about Ernest Gaines is that one time he said that every time he begins to write about a woman in the kitchen, he thinks about his aunt in her kitchen when he was growing up. And I think every tree, every voice of an elder, all of that begins with my childhood. And my imagination starts in that reality before I begin to add the real imagination on. It starts in that reality of memory, and then comes imagination after that.
And the characters, of course, that you write about are so very real and vivid. And as you say, they're in your head. They're your childhood. In many
Yeah,
ways.
I think every elder woman that I write begins with a thread of my grandmother. And the other older black women in the church. Those are the women that I see first when I'm trying to formulate a character. And the same thing with if I'm writing a child character, I don't really, it's not like looking in a mirror, I don't see myself, but I see the kind of children that I was around growing up first. That's what I see. I go to memory first and then add the imagination on top of it.
And Wendell, I suspect you've done a lot of eavesdropping when you were a boy as well. And certainly you are also writing a lot about your childhood. I actually don't know about, in your younger years here in Kentucky, did you write as a young boy, or I'm sure you were a great reader?
Had spells of reading. They came in spells and it wasn't very directed. Well, my mother was a very good picker of books, and I have a big debt to her. But instead of reading from book to book, I'd read the same book over and over again, and lots of the time. And well, I think I have a kind of sympathetic understanding of Crystal around the older women when she was a child. All she had to do was quiet down. Mm-hmm. And there was, I imagine, some eavesdropping. But the women, I didn't eavesdrop on the women. Well, I didn't eavesdrop on the men either. The men that I grew up around, men that work on the farms and so on, didn't censor anything for the better upbringing of a young boy. They just said whatever they had in mind with all the punctuation that it required. And so I heard quite a lot that I didn't understand. Where it came, the women's influence came to me mostly, I think, was from my grandmothers, both of whom had begun their married lives in the households of their mothers-in-law. And they remembered quite a lot. And so when I was growing up and with my grandmothers, and I always listened. But I was hearing from my great-grandmothers quite a lot about the Civil War and those old times.
Yeah.
So it was a very gifted childhood, I think.
And a little delving more into some of the common themes, we emailed back and forth, and you right away said that one of your favorite books of Wendell's was The Memory of Old Jack, and that you said Jack reminded you of your grandfather and your family, your folk. Could you talk a little bit more? And I know that Wendell has said of your writing, too, that he relates to, especially some of the humorous scenes that you had referred to and felt like, yes, I know what that is. I know what that means.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember one of my fondest memories, too, and they're growing now, of course, this one too, but with Wendell is that he and Tanya came to, I think it was like one of my first readings, and it was a snowstorm, and I think they were the only people there. It was in Louisville, and they drove and came to that reading, and I was very appreciative of that. And then the second one was at Northern Kentucky University. There had been a reading for a professor there who had passed away, and we were there, and I read, and Wendell said he liked my work, and I said, and I, of course, almost fainted, and then I said, I want you to know how much I loved Memory of Old Jack, and I said, I just really love that character. It reminded me of my grandfather, and Wendell said, I sure put a lot on him. And so when I was writing The Birds of Opulence, and when I've written since then, I think about what all, he didn't explain. I didn't ask him to explain what that meant, but I often think about that. Have I put enough on him, or on her? Like, is there enough on this character? And what does sort of the burden of their lives mean, the way that they're sort of acting it out? And so another thing that I've thought a lot about regarding Jack and those people at Port Royal is, how all the people I knew were black. And, save a few characters, most of those characters are white. And but yet and still, when Jack is standing on that porch, looking out over his land, sort of contemplating, at that age, as the farm rises and the animals rise and the sun rises and what's going on in nature, I said to myself, that's Silas. That's my grandfather right there, and all the old black farmers like him. Aside from, there's two things that divide these families in the Birds of Opulence, in life. Two things that divide black farm lives and white farm lives is simply skin color and racism. That's the only thing that divides. Nature doesn't let up. It keeps right on going. Things need to be tended to. Floods happen. Life happens. Family happens. Work has to be done. It's the exact same. And I remember crying. Every page of Memory of Jack conjured up tears for me. Every single page. The writing, living in the memories of my own family and in existence, and sort of the things that were starting to be done away with, things that were sold. The ways in which agrarian life was moving away and has left us all in some ways. It was a very moving book, and I still hold it up. And it's a book that I've taught for so long, and I can't teach it anymore in the same ways, because I remember teaching it at Indiana University, and I felt like a mother hen. I was ready to tear into my students. I had a student that said, well, it took so long for that old man to get off the porch, and I found myself saying, what are you saying? And it was hard for me to teach because I was so protective of Jack, of the book.
That recognition doesn't surprise me, because I feel it coming the other way. My young life was maybe more biracial than yours, but I don't remember not knowing black people. And I have an idea that your grandfather and my grandfather were more alike than either of them would be like young people of either race now.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that their experience, and the main thing was that they were inured, accustomed to hard work and the weather, and didn't spend half their lives wondering when it was going to get better or hoping for it to get better. It was a kind of an acceptance.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when I think about rural life, and I think about it now, because I'm spoiled. Like, it's, if I see a spider, I'm going to jump. I act like a city girl now, but I wasn't always that way. But, I think about how much work, if I wake up and I'm cold, I turn the heat up. How much work went into our household to even begin. When I grew up, we didn't even have indoor plumbing. So even to get up, you had to take the pots out, or go out to the outhouse, you had to draw water, you had to bring wood in to get the fire going, to even begin your day before breakfast was even begin to be cooked. There was so much work that went into it. And, not many people do that anymore.
My paternal grandparents' household was like that.
Well, since you brought this up, and I think if you'll indulge me for just a minute, I want to read this paragraph in The Memory of Old Jack that seems to really bring together what you all are talking about, and we can talk about this after. It says about Jack, the work satisfied something deeper in him than his own desire. It was as if he went into the fields in the spring, not just because he wanted to, but because his father and grandfather before him had gone because they wanted to. Because since the first seeds were planted by hand in the ground, his kinsmen had gone each spring to the fields. When he stepped into the first opening furrow of a new season, he was not merely fulfilling an economic necessity. He was answering the summons of an immemorial kinship. He was shaping a passage by which an ancient vision might pass once again into the ground. And I think that's the sense of what you're talking about, right? That love of the land and the rural countrysides and ways of being. And as you've alluded, we've gone so far away from that today, and we see it in every part, our politics, our culture, our society, increasing urban-rural divide. And I don't know if you might each want to give perhaps some observance about that. It seems to me that your writings are bringing about understandings and breaking down stereotypes of rural people. And as you say, talk about the lives of rural people. Would you want to talk about maybe some of that, what we've lost today, and what people don't understand about those days in rural living?
The older of my grandfathers was born in 1864. And the old Jack sort of comes out of my knowledge of the good farmers of that generation, and there were a number of them. But my grandparents were paying for their farms in the 1890s. My grandfather bought his siblings' interest out of the home place. So the 90s were a depression decade. The first decade of the 20th century was just terrible. People were getting nothing for the tobacco crops here. The 20s was already a depression, and then the 30s. So there's, by the time my grandparents on that side celebrated their 50th anniversary, they'd known 35, 40 years of depression. And so that paragraph, I suppose, I was young when I wrote that, but I suppose I was trying to feel through that hardship, my sense of their hardship, and toward the passion that I always felt in my grandfather. And I think that's what kept them going. I think they liked it. I was at a meeting one time with a young rancher from out west, and we were talking about the odds that everybody was up against, and we came to the question, why do they do it? And the answer was love. They do it for love. Maybe that's it. I don't know. There was in my grandfather, who went through all that, and my father, there was a kind of an unquenchable passion for the things of, not the idea, but the things of that life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say the same. You know, my grandfather was born in 1909, and you know, he and my grandmother got married when they were young, and this land they bought it, but it was his father-in-law, my great-grandfather, that he had gotten it from. And I think that passage in Memory of Jack that you just read, for me, speaks of ancestral memory and of the legacy of the land, and sort of that sort of meditation of the routine of keeping it. Like, I just think about so many things that my grandfather did that was routine to him, and sort of like almost in his blood, like to the routine of the day. He got up at the same time every day. He went to bed at the same time every day. He and my grandmother would fuss because, you know, he's like, we got to go to bed around here. And we had like one of the string lights in the kitchen and in the living room. And at 7 o'clock, he would come through the house and cut off all the lights, no matter if we were reading and sewing, quilting, whatever we were doing. He'd cut off all the lights because it was time to go to bed, because the day started so early. And it was the exact same routine every day, and going out to feed. And, you know, he had a very small farm, and he had a tobacco farm, but all the routine of the day, the routines of the seasons. And, you know, these weren't things that he made up. These, of course, were passed down to him from Pa Jim, his father, and passed down yet from Pa Green, who was his father. And this is how things were done. You know, old-time people worked, and there was a routine and a meditation to that work. And it was hard work, but I know in my soul he loved it. He loved it. And, you know, old Jack loved this work.
The regularity of it, the regularity of the demands, the persistence of it, I think helped people to endure and get through those hard times. And farmers have been in hard times very, very much since the beginning of farming. The people in charge have always needed a captive population to produce a surplus. But I think if you've got animals, it's like having children. You can't say no to them. The time comes, you've got to see to them. And there's something consoling about that.
Yeah.
I've experienced it in my own life.
Well, this might be a good time then to talk about the writings of Ernest Gaines, because, of course, he lives large in writing about rural regions and people. And I know, Wendell, he was a friend of yours, and perhaps, I don't know, sometimes like Picasso and Matisse used to have a dialogue between their paintings. I don't know if perhaps in your writings you sometimes felt a kind of a dialogue or kinship as well with his writings. And Crystal, I know you mentioned that studying him helped, I think I read somewhere, in your writing of dialogue of rural people. So would you all want to talk about his influence in your life and writing? And yeah.
Well, you know, the world is round, so again, this is all like one big circle, and I'm often fascinated by this world of writers and the fact that it's such a small world. So again, I'm talking to Wendell once, and he said, well, you know, Ernie said this, that, or the other, and I'm standing there, again, in awe, and I'm thinking, who in the world is he talking about? Ernie. And as the conversation went on, it dawned on me, and of course I stayed cool, calm, and collected when I realized that he was talking about, or that Ernie was the Ernest Gaines. And I think reading his books and also meeting him and sort of walking the land that he writes about, I promised myself I wasn't going to cry today, but it don't take much. But, it's Ernest Gaines gave me permission. Wendell, Gurney, Bobby Ann, Georgella, Gail Jones gave me permission to write about Kentucky. Ernest Gaines gave me permission to write about rural Black people in a very soulful way. The honesty of it, again, the rhythms of the language, the rhythms of the routines. One of my fondest memories of being with Mr. Gaines for that week that I was down there when I did win the Ernest Gaines Prize was being in the graveyard where his family was buried, and how he has this routine of cleaning up this graveyard every year and brings people in from all over to clean it up. But he was I had been to the graveyard for the first time. I'd seen the tree that appears in the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. I'd been to the graveyard, and I was having lunch with him, and he was talking about when he moved his church. The church that he grew up with is now in his backyard. He had the church moved. I don't know if they were about to tear it down or what was going on. And he talked about this moment when the church was being moved, and he felt like he could see the people in the graveyard kind of standing up and saluting as the church went by them. And he knew that they had made that opposite, that they had come out of that church to be buried in that graveyard. And so, of course, for me, what it triggered is I've read about this. I read about this in The Gathering of Old Men, and so that was eye-opening, and also gave me permission to call upon my ancestors and the ancestors for characters and their language in a particular way. His permission to write about Black rural people. I hadn't seen that before I read his writing.
And Wendell, you were young fellas together, and
Well, my experience of our race issue, I'm trying not to say our race problem, because it's not just a problem. It's something that it's a resource, partly in a way, but my experience of that was pretty intense when I was young. I knew a good many, I wrote their names down one night, about 70 some odd, in about 20 minutes I wrote them down. They were people I could have recognized across the street. Some of them I knew fairly by family histories, some of them I loved, but anyway, it has come and gone. But my experience is that this very curious and not a very comfortable going back and forth between the generalizations, the stereotypes, and so on of race relations and the actual relationships and experiences that I have. And so by the time I met Ernie, I was 24 years old, not nearly, much younger than I thought I was. But I learned to think in a liberal way about Black people and so on, but there was Ernie. And we went along and we had a conversation that I can't recount. I'm not sure what it was, but we had to have a meeting. And so we had a meeting in the backyard, somebody's backyard in Menlo Park. And what we were doing was declaring ourselves to each other. We needed to speak of our racial experience. And we did, and it was a very important conversation for me. Ernie told some interviewer not long ago that he was afraid I was going to beat him up, which I'm afraid gives me a lot more credit than he knew I deserved. But anyway, I don't know who started this or who said we need to talk, but we did need to talk, and we did. Experience has a long fuse, you know, and it goes off in stages later. And it now occurs to me that probably Ernie and I had more in common than any two people in that seminar, because we had the race experience between us from, opposite points of view, really. But we had also had a country upbringing. We'd done the same work as young boys and so on. But then Ernie was a very sweet friend to Tanya and me. We'd go out there and we'd see him. He took us to hear Oscar Peterson one night. We'd very weak whiskey, very good music. Anyway, I'd read Ernie's books as they came out, and the remarkable thing to me, my own experience of Ernie's books, was he's speaking for me. He's speaking about the relationship of these people in their land. And by the time A Gathering of Old Men came out, and Johnny Paul stands up and pretty much pronounces the real deed of belonging between him, his people, and the land they'd worked on and suffered on and rejoiced on and died and was buried in. That's just a very important book to me. And I did quote from Johnny Paul's speech up in the mountains, up in Harlan County, a little town up there, the coal company had given a little park to. And I spoke against strip mining and so on, and I read Ernie's Johnny Paul's speech from Johnny Paul's speech, but the coal companies after that took the park away. But anyway, that's the way that goes. I have a big debt, and I don't. Agrarian writers are scarce, you know. He's one of them.
Mm-hmm. And you've said that you mentioned earlier ancestral memory, and Ernest Gaines also taps into that, I think, for you as well. And something I thought was, again, a real commonality between the two of you. You were saying how ancestral memory can shape a person, a culture, and a community. And you said, for instance, you said that slavery is not only a psychological circumstance of the slave, but the slaveholder. And you said, we as Americans are all products of slavery. And Wendell, it seems to me that's your really overarching message in The Hidden Wound that you wrote so many years ago, that it is there is a commonality in that pain.
It's a shared injury. There's no doubt in my mind about it, and you could go in at length, but it's hard to shrug off slavery, and we've still got it, of course, not just racial slavery, but slavery to our machines, for instance. People working hard to support their automobiles. To bear witness about this, as I always am very conscious of myself as half a witness. Mm-hmm. That is, I have authority to speak half the testimony. I can swear to tell half the truth, more or less. But this is a subject that needs to be gone into and understood, and how the idea that we're too good to do our own work is a very dangerous idea, and there's no limit to the harm that is done to white people. But now I'm afraid there's no limit to the harm it's doing to us all. I mean, we're too good now to roll up our own car windows. and the servitude that we're calling the natural world into in order to accommodate our wish to push a button and have the window go up is hard to tell what we're paying for that privilege. But that it's both an injury. Well, it's always an injury, that displacement, but it's hard to contain. It's hard to assume that that all the suffering was on one side too.
And again, that disconnect, as you say, it plays out today in various ways. The disconnect from the land, costs of leaving a home place, has really ancestral consequences.
Well, we haven't got it, but we are not good people yet.
We'll get there.
Yeah, and the fear, with everything that's going on now, it's so circuitous. Like, it's scary to me that, of course, in many ways, we, and I'm talking about me as a black woman, us as black people, us as people, period, are better off in some ways than we were when our grandparents were tending the land. But in some ways, I feel like it's all coming back full circle, and we're getting further and further away from being what a good person should be. Like, we're getting further and further. If it's right here in the center, like, we may have been closer to it in our grandfathers' lives, and the gap has certainly widened in many ways, and that sort of polarization that we see now in the country around politics and around the ballot box and who can vote and who can't, and who gets one ballot box and who gets 3 and who gets 6, and all of that, and our rage behind all of that is certainly still here.
I've said enough by now, I think, to indicate that I'm really interested in the overlap, the common ground. When the scale of agriculture, farming around here outgrew the family scale, the scale of family and neighborly exchanges of work and that sort of thing, the Mexicans, Central Americans began to come in. And it seemed to me, first of all, we were making the same dreadful mistake again. And the second was to see how perfectly strange they were to us and we to them. It gave me a kind of perspective on the old racial arrangement that I grew up in here in my first years. It made me think how nearly we belong to each other. That is, we had 150 years of the same history, we spoke the same language, and we knew each other. The only thing I'm really willing to stand by in my own testimony is that at that time we knew each other. That I think the black people understood us better than we understood them, but they knew probably more about us than we knew about ourselves. But anyway, there was that common knowledge. And here were these people who were coming in as migrant workers. We didn't know them. We didn't have any cultural bond with them. They were strangers, and it really revealed what's wrong with that kind of a dependence.
Why don't we talk a bit about the Birds of Opulence, which is such a beautiful, wonderful book. Well, first of all, it's so, as you're both poets as well as writing stories and novels and essays, and I think that shows in both of your work, which is so beautifully written and has a lyricism to it. And I'm just wondering how you feel as a poet when you're taking on writing stories and a novel, how that poetry maybe informs your novels and the way you're writing. And
Well, I think my poetry only happens in novels. I quit a long time ago, when I was in a room like this one with Morris Manning and Wendell Berry, and all the great poets that I have never published a book of poetry. I've published individual poems here and there. But with this book, dealing with mental illness and dealing with the land, I called upon a poet self. And I found myself saying, okay, the poet is over here, the fiction writer is over here, the archivist for Ancestral, all things ancestral coming directly from my experience is over here. So we had these three different writers. And so I decided that in this book and forevermore, that it's just one person. It's just one writer writing. And all of those experiences should be combined, that the novelist was not a different writer than the poet. The poet was not a different writer than the nonfiction writer or the archivist, that they were all one. So that's how I resolved everything in this book. And I think in what I'm writing now as well, it's that way forevermore. Yeah. Instead of saying, oh, well, I can only do this when I'm being a poet. And of course, I don't mean that there are not, I won't write a novel in verse or anything like that, but I just mean that it's all combined and all useful. And I edited this novel like I would a poem, sort of line by line, and looked at the rhythms of sentences and those kinds of things.
Intense.
So poets and prose writers surely have things to learn from each other. My impression is that you and I both learned to write prose from listening to our own people talk.
Absolutely.
I thought or think that my experience with work crews in tobacco barns and so on, not just men crews either, was maybe the best school that I had as a writer, because these were people who were doing work that most people would consider miserable, but they were having a good time, and partly it was because they were talking. And the talk was shaped by the consciousness of people that they were going to talk for pleasure, that they were going to talk for each other's entertainment. And so that, I think, gets into the syntax. Your dialogue is very strong, and it comes from, well, the way people had of putting things. And it's sometimes, even when they're saying not so pleasant things to each other, the emphasis and rhythm of what they have to say comes to me as a kind of amusement. Boy, they can talk. These people can talk. And that's what I wanted to get into my own dialogue, the people. And my father was very strong in his syntax, I must say. If he was advising you of the truth of some matter, he could make very strong sentences with a cracker on the end.
And also on the book, the cover of your book, I know you have this. I understand the artwork was done by your partner, Ron Davis. And this book the bird is Sankofa, is that right?
Yeah, it's a Sankofa bird.
Sankofa bird, yeah. And the meaning of the bird has a meaning, something to the effect of you need to know about your past to know where you're going. And that, of course, took me to Wendell, you wrote in What Are People For? And we use this quote for the archive of the Berry Center a lot. If you don't know where you're from, you'll have a hard time knowing where you're going. And so that really struck me, that, again, commonality.
I'd say you don't know where you're going anyway, but that's...
Even if you know where you're going.
Well, I'm smarter now than I used to be.
Well, it's the quote we like and we use a lot, so we're sticking with it. But, and again, in this book, so you do write about mental illness, and I believe you're writing also now a follow-up to that, and it's based on your personal history, ancestral memory, again, collected. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, the book that I'm writing on now is supposed to be a nonfiction book, even though I keep wanting to make it into a novel, but about my mother. My mother was diagnosed at 21 before I was born. At 20, and then I was born when she was 21 with schizophrenia. And my grandparents, being rural people, they didn't know what that meant. Nobody knew what that meant in the 60s. So like what that, it was on the forefront of psychotropic drugs. So my mother spent a lot of years sort of being a guinea pig right there at the beginning of it. Well, we'll try this. Does this work? We'll give her shock treatments. We'll do ice baths. So she went through some really horrendous things. And, the poet Nikki Finney, who's a good friend, had kept insisting. My mother was housed in Eastern State Hospital, sort of in and out, and Kentucky State Hospital, which was in Danville, sort of in and out over about a 10-year period. And Nikki knew that. We talked about it, and it's something that, even though the theme of mental illness appears in several of my books and some of the short stories, it was my secret, right? Even though I would tell anybody, open book, but I wasn't really writing about it directly. So Nikki kept saying, well, they're going to make Eastern State a community college. And I said, okay. And I knew what she was saying, but I just sort of ignored her. She said, well, I think you should, they're giving a last tour. I think you should go. And I was like, yeah, okay. And I was sort of avoiding it. And then she said, well, I'm going to pick you up Sunday.
You're going.
So we can go. And so she did, and we took a tour. And I was very... we have to guard ourselves and protect ourselves. So I had a notebook pretending to be writer and, straightened my back, and I was sort of taking notes along the way. But I was trying not to think about it personally. And at the end of the tour, they showed us some of the horrific things, the dungeons where they actually housed people in the basement, which they didn't use anymore. This was just a few years ago, but they did use at the beginning of the history of the institution. And so the woman at the end of the tour said that I could get my mother's records if my mother signed. So that was about 2015. My mother was still alive. She didn't die until 2016, and she signed for me to get her records. And I've been told that there wouldn't be very many records, that it would be, probably medical jargon, and it would be whatever. When I got the records, it was over 400 pages. Among those 400 pages were letters from my grandmother
To your mother.
to the institution saying, I'm calling regarding my daughter, just sort of begging them for some kind of help to try to heal her. So I embarked on this journey to write this book. I still don't know what it's going to become. It's been very difficult, even more difficult since my mother's passed away. But I'm in the smack dab in the middle of it, whatever it is, writing it.
Did you find the Birds of Opulence, obviously, too, probably brought up some things then, difficulties?
Yeah, I think it was the step into the reality. This is probably in some ways, the most fictional book I've ever written. Mm-hmm. I can't point to any character the way that I can in my short stories and say, well, this character is based on this person or that person. But sort of the thread of truth of what happens in a family, what happens in a rural family around mental illness, I think is there and alive. And after I gave myself permission to write that much in the novel, cloaked totally, packed tight with fiction, I've tried to give myself permission to write about it in a more direct way.
Let me ask a question. You're trying to write a true account of your mother. Mm-hmm. And to do that, you've got to have sympathy with her. It's not that it can't be a cold-hearted thing for you.
Right.
Can you have sympathy without imagination? Does this sort of thing worry you?
Not as much as it did. This has been a while since I've been working on it. And what I realized, though, and this will be the first time I've ever really talked about this, is, growing up as the crazy woman's daughter in a small town where everybody says, now I know you're one of them Wilkinson girls. Now, which one are you? And I say, well, I'm Dorsey's daughter. And they go, oh. How you doing? How's your mom? But you see it happen. Mm. So to have that experience as a young child, it sort of sticks with you. And it wasn't until after my mother died that I went back and looked at those pages and realizes that I, not so much at her, but at her condition, that I was writing through a lens of anger. Like, these pages are really have some bitterness. And when I went back to the book, I realized that now I'm writing from a well of grief. And it's a completely different book, so I had to go back and start all over.
Yes. Well, anger is a limiting emotion.
Yeah.
Not much you can do.
Yeah.
Not much hope in it.
Yeah. It's totally different now.
And in the book too, it seems to me you're writing. They're almost like the chapters are like vignettes of memory. Is that maybe a way of how you thought of it or crafted it, or? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I'm very fond of the short story cycle, or the novel and stories, and so that was very much the intent, and I think format content in that I was writing about mental illness and writing about memory, so that form helped the book, I think.
It's beautiful. And similar in a way to the memory of old Jack, I feel like each chapter is a little vignette of memory. A lot of the chapters are named after a person, and then Jack is thinking of that person. Were you conscious of that or thinking? Well, beautifully done. I think we have to wind down pretty soon, but one other thought as we're winding down, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the experience of being a writer about rural people and land, in that I think both of you have said, I think I read somewhere you said that when you were first presented to editors and publishers in New York, they said, great writing, beautiful writing, but we want something, when she wants to write something more contemporary, then we're interested,
Yeah.
And I know that when you and Tanya were living in New York among the writing scene, I think, when you decided to move to Kentucky, it was kind of like, oh, well, there goes the writing career, right? So would you like to maybe talk a bit more about, do you think that's changing a bit? Do you think people now have some imagination and more curiosity? And how have you pursued through that?
Tell them what you told Morris Grubbs about a modern novel.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't remember what I said to Morris.
They said that they wanted a modern book, not
Yeah.
a country book.
Yeah, that's what they said. Yeah, and there very much was that. One of the editors, a big-time editor, said, when she wants to write something more contemporary, let us know. And of course, she wasn't speaking; it was in a letter, but I felt that part. Let us know when she's. So I mean, I feel like I sort of stuck to my guns, because I think that the agrarian story, the rural story, is so important, and I almost see it, not overtly so as a mission, but certainly in my heart. And if I never get to New York, I'll be fine, and I'll keep telling the stories of our people. That's how I feel about it.
All right.
Anything more to add to that?
Well, when I was a very young writer, I gave the publisher I had, and he had published a book, I think, a manuscript of poems, which fortunately nobody wanted to publish, but the publisher showed them to a young poet, maybe a young woman poet, I'm not sure, but anyway, that the publisher evidently respected and wanted her opinion. And her opinion was that the experience of the present and the coming world was urban, and that the poetry was wrong because of its content. Well, I don't think either of us decided to write about rural people because they're so interesting. You have to do what go with what your inheritance is. But anyway, put bookends to this, Paul Krugman published his column in yesterday's New York Times saying that, he made an absolute distinction between real America and rural America. So you see, between, when would I have shown that fellow my poetry manuscript? About 1960, say. So there's 58 years, and it's still the same. That people are convinced that the definitive experience, if not the only experience that's of any account, is. Paul Krugman is an economist. He knows that people have to eat, presumably, and out here in this negligible country. Well, my next project is to get rural America enrolled in the United Nations.
Well, there we are. We can't top that, right? So, well, I have to say, I'm sure everyone here, we're all grateful that you stuck to it and you're writing about the people that you know and have affection for in the land. And it's, as your story just illustrates, even just gets more and more important to bridge those gaps and allow people to have imagination about rural life and living and how we can live together. We thought it would be really great if you could read a section when you talk about home place. Here at the Berry Center, we have programs that are very much grounded in the thought of local economies and the home place. And so we think that would be very fitting because we believe very much that it's the local first that's going to keep your food and your land and your economies and your culture intact and healthy. And so would you mind reading a part from the Birds of Opulence?
Sure. In late August, when Minnie May and her sons arrive at the home place, the country feels like it's settling down to rest for the night. A slight breeze rustles the trees and sounds grow up and out around them until the hundreds of creatures, large and small, become one loud voice. It is as if the night has taken up the voices of the good kin long past, and even Butter and June with their new city ways have to listen. The old house leans and the porch sags, this same old place where Minnie May and Henry lived as a young couple. Every spring, the boys come to help Minnie May clean up the yard and plant the early garden. In fall, they come help her rake the leaves. Though nobody lives there now, she insists on sweeping the dirt around the back porch into a series of swirling patterns and pinching back the hens and chickens growing in a big white tub on a stump. Butter leans on the handle of a grubbing hoe, and June stands holding a clump of weeds, the fresh white roots reaching down toward the ground. "This is y'all's what for," Minnie May says, placing one hand on her hip and the other one spreading far and wide from one edge of the knob across the creek to the other side. The moon is out and the farm is glowing behind her. "All this," she says, "been up under y'all's feet, your people's feet, since slave times. My mama and daddy worked this land and their mama and daddy before them. Old man Hezekiah started all this," she said. "Back in 1878, just 100 years after Daniel Boone blazed the bloody trail through here, killing every Indian he saw. Old man Hezekiah, he was freed from Virginia, paid $158 for 8 acres of land right here. Old-time people always said that old Hezekiah was a tree of a man, a master carpenter. They say he got fighting mad when white folks called this nigger town. So he put up a sign 20 foot long across the road there saying this place was to be called Opulence. Of course, a lot of people around here then didn't know what that meant, but the old-time people say he cut the sign out of the finest woods and carved elk, bison, foxes, and birds all over it, and then wrote Opulence, as delicate as a teacher's cursive with the chisel. It's been Opulence ever since. It's true. Minnie May loops her arms around the waist of her boys, fingers from one hand wrung through the loops of Butter's, belt loops, the other resting on June's back. "This is going to be y'all's and Tookie's one day. Pap stood right out there by that well and said that's all a man needs, and some little piece of rich earth and a good woman. Reckon he got what he needed in your grandmother, and she got what she needed in him. Minnie May shifts her hips to ease the aching through her hip bone, looks from one of her boys to the next. I don't know nothing about being a man. Can't say I've raised you up to be good men, but I've done the best I can. I do know what a good man is. Your daddy was a good man. My daddy was a good man. Good man's more than breath and breeches. Man has gumption. Woman, too. Woman's got to have more gumption than a man sometimes. Woman goes through more things and then got to help the man bear his burdens. Butter breaks his mother's grip. Mom, I don't see why you don't sell this old place. None of us set up to be farmers. We all got our own lives, good lives. It's just sitting here growing weeds, the house falling in. He places his hand on her shoulder. You know you're getting too old to keep putting in a garden, and look at that house. Ain't nothing much left but firewood. Hush your bad mouth. Can't even see yourself when you're feasting your eyes right in the looking glass. Hush your ignorant mouth. This ain't about no grate of wood on no house. Mama, Butter's right. June looks down toward the ground and kicks at dust. Deep down he knows his mother is the freight train, gaining steam that she's always been. Not much meek and mild about her even now. Not one but two full-grown damn fools. Take me on back home. Can't see yesterday, then you don't know what's coming your way tomorrow. Let's get going. Plumb damn ignorant. You are ashamed before God, your daddy, and all your people. Again, the boys who have somehow, without Minnie May, noticed and turned into men, well, some kind of men, stare at their mother as though an old folks' home would suit her fine, with a patronizing glint in their eyes, usually reserved for young children who have gotten out of line. She is angry at them both, but Minnie May's heart still dances with glee when her boys come home. And even though they're adults with grown children, she still dotes on them and fixes blackberry cobbler for Butter and corn pudding for June, even when her legs are hurting her bad. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Nothing more to say.